just one push.
Test, test. Yeah,
Yeah, you're good.
fine.
All right, you already know.
Test.
There's usually little signs around that say like keep the Wi-Fi password. Corey Mossberg, National Intelligence, they can really help us set it up. If we want to provide some ongoing, that's what our apartments, that's what they.
And we have it in our compost pile too. I'm like, we probably haven't even had a garden coming out of our compost pile. I was on our place, we have a bunch of. Yeah, so it was never, it started as a kid.
Build beds, scratch, they can take existing beds.
All the way down, love it all, you know, all of that good stuff, you know.
Chefs.
And the truth is, we had what was then called the name every day, but the day that we saw the roads and then just it did all of that stuff, and then she did it and made it. In the summer, we could come out, there's things and we got this. She's like my grandmother's, and if they had it, it'd be 6 and out there just shelling.
C4, cool. Good morning, everybody. Why don't we kind of get started? We'll do a really odd thing at Trinity. We'll start on time. So welcome to session 5, and appreciate you all being here with Food, Faith, and Farms. And why don't we start with prayer? So please bow your heads. Dear Lord, thank you for this glorious day and each day that you give us. Help us become more aware and conscious of ways that we can best protect and serve the world you created in your world. In your name, amen. So we are welcoming back Mark Douglas. He is a terrific teacher. I'm sure a lot of y'all have had him. Mark grew up in Colorado on a farm, so this is a subject that's near and dear to his heart. Trying to save paper since I've already messed up the environment making this phone. I'm going to use the phone. So this is Mark is a professor of Christian ethics at Columbia Theological Seminary. He is known for his work in religious language in the public sphere, medical and business ethics, the American philosophical tradition of pragmatism, the environment, just war and pacifism, and his role in political philosophy. So he touches a lot of things. He also served as a pastor at Tabor Presbyterian Church in Virginia in the late 90s. And so he's seen it from certainly the academy, the actual day-to-day running of a church from a business perspective. Obviously, he's a big thinker and is drawn to big ideas and working on big problems. So, Mark, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, John. I was sharing with Alan, it's good to be back here. I think every 2 years, I'm back to teach some course here on some topic, and I teach a pretty wide variety of topics. But I was sharing with Alan, I think you all have exhausted me. I've run out of topics, things that I teach on that you all have touched on everything. And then you'll ask me to talk about food. I thought, well, okay, I haven't done anything on food for you all. So it's a real pleasure to be here. By way of reminder about where we are, the first week, John came and talked about regenerative agriculture and shared some videos, I think, of some work being done locally. And then the second week, you all had Dan Latham, member at First Press, come in and talk about food and food consumption. And then for the last 2 weeks, you've had Sam Adams, a professor of Old Testament at Union Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Richmond, do some work on scripture and food. And then you get me for the last 2 weeks, kind of the denouement. So this week, I want to talk about food and environmental justice. And next week, I'm going to talk about food and climate change. So we'll end on high notes along the way. Some of you may have observed this picture on my cover slide. That is my family farm. This is still a working farm. My mom lives in one house on the farm. My sister and nephew's niece live next door. One nephew, niece in college, but when she's back, she's there. One nephew has moved out. I'll say a word or two about them. And this is kind of what it looks like. So that's the hay barn and the machine shed on the right, and then you can see a little bit of my sister's house on the left back there. We grow a wide range of things. We usually grow on 2 of the outer fields, what we call the east field and the west field. We grow alfalfa and hay for horses, cows, and lambs. My nephews and niece showed lambs competitively. Both my oldest nephew and niece were grand champions for their lambs. At one point, my nephew also showed steers. You can see a little bit of the hay shed. You can see kind of keep cattle in the area, but we also have grown corn. And I don't know if you can see right in here, there's this kind of skinny thing. That is our pivot. It's irrigated fields. And if you're ever flying over the Midwest and you see those big circles, that's where the pivots are, right? That's where the irrigation happens. And so this field is pivot-driven irrigation as opposed to down here you can see pipe for pipe-driven irrigation. So corn, some of our, me and one tractor taking a picture of another tractor at work. I think that's my nephew, as I recall, it's my nephew out there walking back to the tractor. He was doing baling on that tractor at the time.
Where is it?
It is east of Fort Collins, so northern part of Fort Collins. And if you're familiar with Colorado, right, it's a big rectangular state, and the mountains run right down the middle. The mountains come down, and then there's a little valley, and that valley is where all the cities are, Denver and Longmont and Fort Collins and Boulder and Colorado Springs. And then it goes up a little bit into High Plains, and the family's farm sits right at the edge of High Plains looking over Fort Collins. So at night we actually see the light of Fort Collins looking down from looking west from the east. Where am I? This is my family farm. Grew up farming, and that has led to a significant commitment to issues of environment and land, and a very non-romantic attachment to it, because I know what farming life is like, and I know kind of the costs that come with it. I also know how hard it is because on our family farm, I didn't get a picture of it. My mom kept a great big garden. It's like a third of the size of this room. And so would grow food for us through the year and do canning and pickling and all that kinds of stuff. And my sister and I were indentured servants to the garden. And at 5,280 feet, the sun beats down pretty hot. And there's bugs on it, and you're bent double working on the garden, and I grew to detest gardening. Just hated it. I didn't mind working on the tractors and being out and around, but didn't like the garden. It turned out the thing that I was better at than farming was school, and I was so good at it, I just kept going. So after an undergraduate degree, did 2 master's degrees at Princeton Seminary, and then did my doctorate work at University of Virginia in religious ethics, and Columbia hired me from there. And so I live in Decatur and have been on the faculty for 25 years. Some of my former students darken the door sometimes. Good to see you, Lucy. About maybe 10, 12 years ago, I thought, I've lost touch with where my food comes from. And I do not want a garden if it's anything like what I worked on. I want it to be easy to manage. I want it to be so I don't have to get bent double very much. I want it to be easier. So I put this in the backyard. It's a small raised bed that I can grow enough to remind me. I'm never going to make a full meal out of anything that I grow in this raised bed, but it's something to remind me where food comes from, which is a handy thing, I think, for all of us to be doing. And then I realized I've got to get water to this garden, so I put in a rain barrel that I can use to water the bed. So that's a little bit about my background and how I got into kind of these questions about food and food stuff, of which there are many. And there are many questions related on food issues, many justice issues as well. And I want to walk through these a little bit to start to talk about where there's some intersections between how we think about food and how we think about justice. So some food concerns. We want to think about where does our food come from? Who's creating it? Where is it being created? We want to think about what types of varieties of food are out there. Increased monoculture has a big impact on making our food less expensive. It also has a big negative impact on environmental sustainability over the long term, which can have an impact on our own food in the future. We want to think about how it's distributed. Where does it come from? Where does it go? I love being in a big urban center where I can go down to your DeKalb Farmers Market and get food that came in from all over the world. So, if it's not season for tomatoes, so what? I can get a really good tomato. But there's costs associated with that kind of distribution of food. We want to think about access. Who has access to foods? I know you all have talked a little bit about food deserts, right? Spaces, especially in urban centers where people don't have access to healthier foods without having to get into transportation and travel quite a while to get there. We want to think a little bit about quantity. How much food do we eat in a nation where there is an obesity epidemic? That we want to be paying attention to that. That obesity epidemic is also related to the quality of food, right? What kind of food, what kinds of food are we eating? We want to think then about kind of projects of consumption. We also want to know what happens with waste in both our individual lives, right? Are we composting? And more corporately, what happens with waste for food production? And then we want to think about the future of food. Food only exists generation to generation, and anybody can tell you, like, what we need to be thinking about is what kind of seeds are we going to have into the future? Do we want seeds to be controlled by large firms or not, when Monsanto can engineer seeds that are very productive, but that they have rights to, which means you can't grow any other kind of seed, and they can sue you if seed infects other properties, and that seed is often has special genetic properties that make it, say, bug resistant, which is kind of a good thing because that means less pesticide, other than the fact then that genetically modified food can have an impact on endurability over the long run. So the future of food. So these are some of the issues of food concerns. Hold those on the left side for a moment, and I want to name kind of some of the ways that people like me, ethicists, think about justice. Down at the bottom, I have a little quote. John probably can't see it. Latin isn't really a spoken language, so when I get it wrong, just recognize that there's no way to get it right. Justitius cum sique distribut by Cicero, which means justice means giving what is due. The justice concerns then have to do with how do you discern what is due, to whom, and on what basis. Justice concerns operate in different spheres. So because I'm at Trinity Presbyterian Church, I assume that at least 2/3 of the people that I'm speaking with are or have been lawyers. Yeah. So the legal profession wants to think about justice issues in particular ways. Religion wants to think about justice in particular ways. Economists want to think about justice in particular ways. I'm going to talk about a particular economist in a little bit who does justice work. So there's different spheres in which justice operates, and the way that lawyers and religious ethicists talk about justice may not be quite the same, although there overlap. Some of that has to do with the different frameworks for ethics that come out of it. Legal ethics is by and large positive law ethics, right? Here's the decrees and the statutes. Here's the event. How does this event fit into those things? That's not the kind of work that I do. I do the kind of work where there's no set of rules that you kind of just refer to along the way. Beyond spheres, then there's different focal points for thinking about justice. So you might recognize retributive justice. What is due to those who cause harm to others? What type of punishment? Retributive justice. Distributive justice. How do we equitably distribute to others what is due to them, recognizing that in distributive justice there are different frameworks in which we might think about distributive justice. Do we say what is due is on the basis of need, on the basis of merit, on the basis of equality? All of those different forms of thinking about justice, about distributive justice, will come up with different answers to what is due. Contributive justice. What do individuals owe to the society in which they live? Or commutative justice. What do individuals owe to each other within their proper society? Restorative justice. What types of actions should we take in order for people and species to be restored to flourishing? Related to that, but slightly different, reparative justice. Where there has been harm done, what obligations toward repair are owed, what is due as a result of harm done. Social justice, what are the conditions that create flourishing? Broadly stood and closely related to that is, at least in Western cultures, procedural justice. What are appropriate procedures for thinking about who is owed what? How do we discern what is due? And then, even within those things, we'll recognize that justice can mean different things. Is justice a norm? Is it a law? Is it a goal? Is it a virtue? And part of what I want to get at here with this right side is that we throw the word justice around pretty cavalierly. It's actually pretty complicated, and saying that you're going to pursue justice has not yet really started you on long questions about what it means to pursue justice in any particular setting. All right, somewhere between our food concerns and our justice concerns lies environmental justice. Now, environmental justice, the US government has given a very long and fancy definition to. It goes like this. Environmental justice means the just treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of income, race, color, national origin, tribal affiliation, or disability, in agency decision-making and other federal activities, note the word federal that shows up there, that affect human health and the environment so that people, A, are fully protected from disproportionate and adverse human health and environmental effects, including risks and hazard, including those related to climate change, the cumulative impacts of environmental and other burdens, and the legacy of racism or other structural systemic barriers, and B, have equitable access to a healthy, sustainable, and resilient environment to which to live, play, work, learn, grow, worship, and engage in cultural and subsistence practices. Yeah. All right. That's what lawyers do. Let me give you mine. Environmental justice is the pursuit of those conditions which promote the flourishing of all creatures in a given ecosystem. Much neater. Way less detailed. I mean, the advantage of the other one is that as you get into particular issues, you can actually kind of find your source. We have to pay attention to this, have to pay attention to that, have to pay attention to this group of people, have to pay attention to that group of species. But Mark's definition, I think, will mostly work for us. Did you want the picture of the previous word? Okay. John's over here taking pictures. This is my better side, so I'm fine with that. Okay. So that's environmental justice. What does it look like in the context of food? Well, here's some things we might be thinking about in the context of food and environmental justice. Food's creation, right? I'm going to go through that list that was on the left-hand side. Who owns land and machinery? My family has family friends throughout the West and Upper Midwest, and I've spent time driving through, for instance, South Dakota, where my oldest nephew went to college. And there you find entire towns that are by and large ghost towns. A town that maybe had 600, 800 people, primarily farming community, is now down to 50, 40, 30, maybe. Some of that is generational. The work for younger people was elsewhere. Some of that is, as large agribusiness has bought up family farms, there's less need for for those families to be in that place and less opportunity for them to work, right? So who owns land and machinery? Who works in agriculture? Some of the bigger debates within the Presbyterian Church USA, at least in some contingents, has been debates about whether and how to think about joining on to boycotts of particular food industries over problematic, immoral, even illegal working conditions. So we have regularly joined on with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, who does grow and harvest tomatoes, especially in Florida, because the tomato growers have often worked at effectively at slave labor levels. And then they've sold their tomatoes to major industries, Wendy's, Publix, others. And so from time to time, the denomination is boycotted. And what resources are used in food production? Where does Where do these resources come from? Variety, what types of food are grown and raised, and what is the impact of the growth of foodstuffs on the wider natural world? If you took the total biomass of all non-human mammals on Earth, right? All the wild animals and all the domesticated animals, everything that kind of is a mammal on Earth outside of human beings, and you weighed it. Domesticated animals constitute at this point something like 93 to 95% of that biomass. We create more and more space for domestication, and you have wild animals lose more and more space along the way. So what is the impact of the growth of foodstuffs on the wider natural world? This also applies not only to mammals and to animals, but to insects. Anybody here deal with bees? Every once in a while there's like a class like, yeah, I raise bees. It's a weird urban thing these days. Catastrophic hive loss that has real implications for pollination for foods in the future. So variety gets tricky there. Distribution, who manages distribution and what are the environmental and other costs to distribution? That tomato that I get from South America is really tasty. It costs a lot more environmentally for me to eat that tomato than the one that I grew in my little raised bed. Access, who has access to what kinds of foods? And what is the relationship between access to food and human rights? We have declared since the advent of the human rights age that there's a basic human right to food, to nourishment necessary for our survival. We don't always live that way. Quantity, how much of what kinds of food are being raised and grown and for whom and what? And what are the human and environmental health costs associated with the quantity of food? Quality, how healthy are the foods that we eat, and who has access to healthy food? Fun tangent on that first one. Famous liturgical theologian from England was asked at one point whether he could consider a hot dog and a Coke as something that could be taken liturgically as part of the Eucharist. You know, because they were doing this in the 60s, 70s, 80s, like, youth groups. They may still be doing it. And he paused and he said, well, the reason I cannot think of a hot dog and Coke as the Lord's Supper is I cannot think of them as food. Just a little joke on the side. All right. And who has access to healthy foods? How much food should we eat and of what sort? Waste, what portion of food goes to waste, either in its production or its consumption? A substantial amount of what goes into our landfills can be composted, but most of us do not compost, and compost has, the lack of compost has environmental effects, right? That food waste over time produces methane that has to go somewhere, which is a pretty potent greenhouse gas, for instance. Who wastes food and what happens to wasted food? And the future. What does food sustainability look like in the long run, and how is climate change reshaping all this? That's more next week. I want to talk about food and climate change. For a moment, though, before I kind of jump into the next slide and get a little bit specific, let me pause and ask if there's questions or comments. Also, arguments. I'm an ethicist. I argue for a living. I'm totally comfortable with that. So, John.
How does price, we've squeezed so much cost out of...
You're setting me up for 2 slides from now.
Okay, then I'll be quiet.
All right. No, you don't have to be quiet. I'm just saying, like, 2 slides, I'm going to go right to that. Yeah.
This is just a comment. I just feel like I need to go get a box of Kleenex because every one of these are so out of balance that I can't sit here frankly and hold it because I know what you're going to say.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is heavy and sometimes dire stuff. Is that the share, or Velma, did you have a question?
I'm the walker arounder.
Okay.
We got to hear it, people.
Yeah, thank you. That's right. We have people online. So online, if you didn't hear John was asking about costs and price and how that works, and I'm going to come back to that in a couple slides. And remind me, Judy. Judy was just saying this is really heavy, costly, kind of, this causes a kind of a level of suffering in us as we experience it. Anything else? So let's zoom in a little bit and think about red meat. And I will tell you on the front end, I eat red meat. My family, as you saw, raises cattle. I also grew up hunting, so we have game, elk, deer, antelope in our refrigerator at home on the farm. One of my friends from high school was one of the national officers for Future Farmers of America, and now runs is the host of a TV show, Cattleman to Cattleman, was the president of National Beef Association or something like that at one point. And Kevin and I think, the two of us will not at all be surprised if we become family within the next year or so, because his daughter is seriously dating my nephew. So when I talk about kind of meat eating, I'm invested. I'll also note, and I should have put this up here on a slide, that some of what I'm about to talk about a little bit comes from a really lovely article by an author named Michael Pollan called Power Steer, where Michael Pollan buys a cow in South Dakota and traces that cow's life from kind of just after birth until it becomes part of what comes to his table. So, among the moral considerations we might want to think about, or we should be thinking about with regard to red meat, was the cow grass or corn-fed? Cows are ruminants. They have extra stomachs, and in those extra stomachs, which tend to be pH neutral, there are bacteria that help them break down grass and turn grass into protein. We can't do that. The way we get protein from grass is we eat the cow that ate the grass. You are what you eat eats. Cows are not naturally corn eaters. Their systems are not built for corn. But through U.S. subsidies and other advantages, you can buy corn for 50 cents less per bushel than it costs to grow corn. And you can put a lot of corn into a cow to plump it up quickly. On grass, to grow something until the point of slaughter is going to take 4 or 5 years. On corn, you can usually do it in 12 to 14 months. Because cows are not natural corn eaters, eating corn disrupts their system. So in order to make sure that that cow doesn't get really unhealthy and even potentially die from bloat and other things, you also have to do certain things like give it antibiotics and other types of medicines to control it. So a lot of antibiotics go through the U.S. Cattle system in order to keep cows from getting sick and dying from the corn that they're eating. And also note, by the way, that the way corn is produced is one of the largest silage corn for animals, not corn like sweet corn. The way corn is produced, we use enormous amounts of fossil fuels, right? Not only the fossil fuels associated with the machinery that goes out and runs the corn, but at least since after World War II, we use oil-based fertilizers. The irony of all this, as Pollan points out then, is that we have taken one of the magnificently solar-powered species in existence, the cow, and turned it into another fossil fuel vehicle. Pollan estimated that per cow, each cow in a feedlot probably has at some point cost around 286 gallons of oil along the way. So is the cow grass or corn-fed? Turns out to be an important question. Y'all ever go to the grocery store and look at the difference between a cost between kind of like, here's what it costs just for the steak and here's what it costs for the grass-fed steak? Triple the price often. That's part of the driver for this. Though it's a little bit sneaky on that. as I'll talk about in just a moment, about grass-fed versus corn-fed. Was the cow raised in a feedlot or on a range? Out on a range, cows and grasses kind of are part of the natural ecosystem, works pretty well. Both sides benefit. In the feedlot, you get concentrations of waste. You can smell a feedlot a lot further away than you can just a farm. And when that waste disperses, it has impacts quite significantly negative on wider environment. And so between the types of pesticides and herbicides we put on corn and the waste that we produce, we're creating huge dead zones environmentally. The pesticides and the herbicides and whatnot and the fertilizers that have kind of led to nitrogen enriching of rivers has kind of come down the Mississippi, and now you have something like a 12,000 square mile dead zone at the end of at the Gulf of the Mississippi as a result of all this. So was it raised on the feedlot or a range is important for a variety of reasons. Was it given hormone implants to promote faster growth? Hormone implants tend to go into cows very early on, and they can lead to much quicker growth. There is some concern without any clear causal evidence that some of what we're seeing in society about some genetic malformations of other species in the area, as well as humans hitting puberty earlier, may be a product partly of kind of our ingestion of hormones kind of going forward. Was the cow exposed to antibiotic-resistant bacteria? You cannot go into a major feedlot and not find E. coli in the waste. It's there. It's also out in the farms, but at much lower concentrations. This starts to get really tricky because when cows live in feedlots, the production of their waste and the E. coli, they carry it around with them, including into the slaughterhouse. So one of the biggest issues that slaughterhouses have to negotiate is how to make sure that the manure from outside doesn't end up on the meat inside, because if it does, you're going to end up with outbreaks that can cause harm to people and others. And because there is so much kind of this E. coli and stuff, more antibiotics flowing through the system. Antibiotics favor the things that they kill, but they also promote resistance to antibiotics over time. Where and how was that cow slaughtered? There are kind of basic humane issues with this. John and I were talking about Temple Grandin, who has taught at Colorado State University and kind of designed more humane ways for doing this. But also, how was it slaughtered in terms of, this is unsurprising but kind of strange. If you get an anxious cow, upon slaughter, it impacts the quality of the meat, right? So how a cow is slaughtered can impact how we eat. Also, again, go back to trying to keep the manure away from the meat, which is a tricky thing in slaughterhouse systems. Was its meat irradiated? One way to deal with the potential for infection is to irradiate the meat and try and kill off all the stuff, the E. coli and other stuff that's in the midst. How was the meat sealed? We like steak that looks red. We don't like steak that starts to look a little bit grayish. One of the tricks of the trade is that you inject carbon dioxide into the container and then seal it, because carbon dioxide doesn't change because it doesn't oxidize the meat till it make it look a little bit grayer. I've heard, I've never trusted, studies that said you can't actually, on a blind taste test, tell the difference in taste. I've never had the courage to eat grayish meat. Where was it from and how did it arrive at our tables? Right? There's transportation associated with moving what was a cow and is becoming steak to us. And what are the environmental costs for beef in comparison to other foods? Just the sheer energy to create plant foods is far less than the sheer energy in terms of kind of just kilocalories to produce meat. If we have limited energy resources, it all starts at solar, but it kind of makes its way through. If we have limited energy resources, is beef the best way to spend our energy resources as opposed to some other types of things? What are the health impacts of beef in comparison to other foods, or even within itself? There's some studies that show that part of what the hormones in the corn do is lead to better marbling, right? Those little thin stretches of fat that go through that make it tasty and tender, that those also tend to have higher levels of the bad kinds of fats in them than grass-fed. So health impacts of just beef against beef, but also health impacts of beef against other foods. And then how does bovine sentience, how does the fact that this is a creature that senses things, that feels, matter in thinking about this? I know a lot of folks often kind of turn toward vegetarian diets starting here and then build out from there. And as I say, I'm not one. But I do kind of pay attention to what my colleagues who are say. All right.
Don't speak, don't come up, no.
Yeah.
Given your deep study, in our community, we've had a lot of talk about conflict of interest lately in the legal system. How do you see yourself in the inherent conflict between vegetarianism and your family occupation?
That's a great question. By and large, even my vegan friends are mostly pretty happy with me because I do tell them I try and pay attention to where my food comes from. I try to eat healthier expressions, so I don't eat as much meat as I once did, although I continue to eat meat. I actually gave up red meat for a while in seminary in a kind of an attempt to live more virtuously, and I went home after a couple of months, and there was meat at every meal, and I was sick to my stomach, like literally, I couldn't digest the meat. And I thought, I don't need to have this fight with my family, and I don't want to be sick every time I come home. And so I've kind of switched back, and I do eat red meat. I don't eat as much. And I still hunt. And people that have asked questions, my kind of quip is the meat that I eat from hunting has had a good life and a bad day. The meat that comes from the feedlots has a pretty lousy life. So most of my vegan friends actually say, like, yeah, if you're going to be a meat eater like Mark. And it's just a matter of attention. That's, I think, the biggest thing that I would hopefully come out of. Just pay attention to where your food, not just meat, but where your food comes from. Yeah.
Hi. I have two questions. One, does packaging that doesn't say grass-fed mean it is corn-fed?
Right. So it tends to be corn-fed. That's the much less expensive way to do it. The trick is that one way that they have discovered to reduce risk of disease and spread of bacterial infection is to turn cows in the last kind of, say, several weeks of their life back toward hay and grass. So there are some that are like, in which case it's grass-fed again, and we can advertise it as grass-fed.
Oh, right.
Which goes back to not just kind of seeing what's on the sign, but knowing where it came from. John talked a fair amount about regenerative agriculture. And what's the name of the? White Oak Pastures, right? You know where that cow came from. You know how it was raised and slaughtered. That's better than just going to the supermarket and kind of saying, well, here's a sign that says grass-fed.
Okay.
The not always accurate, but nevertheless handy short of hand that I'll get to on the next slide is probably more expensive, means more likely to have been grass-fed throughout.
Okay. And just one quick question on the sealing of the meat.
Mm-hmm.
I had read one time that the red is not actually blood. Is that true?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
is that...
they've bled out. Yeah, that's just what the muscle looks like. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the red?
You would have to ask my nephew, who is in the cattle industry. Yeah.
It's not a dye.
That's not a dye.
Okay.
No.
So now I'm really worried about everything that I eat that's red meat. But how do we find out all these things? I mean, when you go to Publix, they don't say there are no hormone implants and it's grass-fed and all of that. How do you, I mean, does Buckhead Beef subscribe to all this?
So you're going to stick with we're going to stick with beef for just a moment and say that go to local butchers who know their sources as a more accurate way of kind of at least knowing about. But the same is true not only for beef, but for other kinds of meat and also for our fruits and vegetables, right? Where there are farmers markets. I think, John, you said this is how you got started in this kind of concern. You know where the food came from. I mean, work to figure out. Supermarkets aren't great at sharing that, although they're getting a little bit better. But you can track and you can find out because the internet. Where does Publix get its tomatoes? You can do this kind of work. It takes more. There's a way in which we've always liked turning the blind eye to what we eat, especially as we became more urban because it hid us from the dirty secrets of what it means to live a life of consumption and of causing the death of other sentient things. All right, one other thing I want to talk about here that may be helpful and goes back to John's question about cost. I want to introduce you to Sir Partha Dasgupta, who is the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. Sir Partha was raised in India, moved to the UK, had a distinguished career there, and in his career focused on several things with regard to economics: welfare and development economics, economics and technological change, the value of social capital, that is kind of those things that we have trouble putting prices on, but they're nevertheless valuable. So we put weird prices on them, like we know this land costs more than this land because this is in a better school district than that property. How did we figure out what a school district was worth? It's a little bit arbitrary, but it still matters, that social capital. What is Trinity Presbyterian Church able to do to change the way not only its members think about how they engage the world around them, but maybe some of the communities and some of the mission work that they do? That's social capital. He also thinks about environment and ecological economics and the economics of malnutrition. And Sir Partha had two big ideas. The first big idea is he said that economists need to think about inclusive wealth. It isn't simply capital that you have. Wealth includes land, often not measurable in the same way. It includes social capital. What type of influence do I have in a particular community? It includes natural capital. What is the value of the natural world around me that we have been resistant to actually putting price tags on? It includes beauty. How do we feel about this space? He says, all of that is part of what inclusive wealth means. And we ought to pay attention not just to kind of the capitalist small understanding of here's what the market will bear, but a wider vision of wealth. And then he says, we need to figure out how to pay what things cost through attention to natural capital. His big claim here is what we don't value, we destroy. So, Sir Dasgupta's argument is that, as I apply it to food, as he's applied it to food, is when we think about food, not just steak, but every food we eat, we need to be paying attention not only to what the market says this thing costs in the supermarket, what the market broadly conceived in the capitalist system says this thing costs, but also to other aspects of the value of this thing. It's not an easy task, as you were raising questions about, but it's an important one, and it ought not to be done simply at individual levels, because we can go all conscientiousized and be more righteous than our next door neighbors by paying attention to this stuff, but the larger project is to think about how do we reshape policy that's attentive to social capital, to natural capital, to beauty, to those types of things. And Sir Dasgupta has actually kind of developed economic systems that can help us do that. So this, I think, is part of my answer to your question, John, is that people who are thoughtful about their eating are thinking more expansively about where costs are. Doesn't necessarily make it easy, and I would argue that the thing that people who want to be conscious about their eating most need to do is be thinking about how do they participate in American democratic practices that lead to the shaping of policies that are for the flourishing of creatures and ecosystems, environmental justice, my definition, or that where there is disproportionate or undue cost to the flourishing in ecosystems. How you vote is a big aspect of how you eat.
Do you mind touching on externalizing cost, how the industry, for example, the creation of the dead zone in the Gulf, I would argue is an externalized cost that we're all paying, although most of us aren't conscious of it.
Yeah. Can I do it in the time we have left? Can I put a pin in it and say let's touch on it next week? Because next week when we talk about climate change, then we're going to have to come back and talk about this a little bit more.
Could you at some point in your talks talk about the economics of malnutrition in Atlanta, in our local area? What I've seen recently is that the things we're talking about is at a rare high level, and that the poor do not understand food or any of the things we're talking about, and are great victims, don't know how to access it, and can't get it, and go without it.
Yeah. Externalized costs. One of the externalized costs in the way our system of food production and consumption is set up is to exclude from those costs the actual social costs for the betterment of ourselves and others that come with bad health. Poor health in society costs all of us a lot of money, but we've separated that cost from a bunch of other costs that we've paid associated with it that we think are internal to it. Yeah.
For those who don't know, Grady Hospital has a food pharmacy where they prescribe fresh foods. Part of that is to get those, you go to cooking classes, and we can volunteer down there. It's a lot of fun. I invite you to come do that. It's at Grady.
Yeah. The other piece I would just touch on there is the American healthcare industry is responsible, according to decent studies, for about 22 to 24% of U.S. health. The rest of our health is a product of our genetics and our environment primarily, right? You're more likely to be healthy based on genetics and where you live than the fact that you have access to a doctor who can give you an inoculation for flu or COVID or whatever, or treat cancer. The costs to poor health are significant, and to the degree to which environment is a major contributor to U.S. health, more than the U.S. healthcare industry. Probably when we talk about health and medicine, we need to talk more about public health and environment than we do. And public health leaders, if y'all have not done a series on public health, get some folks in, whether it's from kind of Emory or wherever. It's public health folks do amazing stuff in that regard.
Thank you, Mark. We've got to get to church soon.
Yep, so I'm wrapping up here. I just want to give a couple of caveats. The first is that Sardas Gupta, although he has kind of emphasized this pay what things cost, still is important justice questions to address. If we actually all paid what things cost, we would price some people right out of buying any number of healthier foods, and they'd be back into eating less healthy stuff that they can get more cheaply. The second is that one of the concerns of his argument is that it reduces nature to commodity. He's trying to figure out how to put money on things. And some people are saying there are some things you shouldn't just be able to put money on. These are important considerations. We'll talk a little bit more about them next week. What Professor Sir Dasgupta would point out then is that when we get into all that stuff from this earlier slide that made us all sad,